You wake up to the sound of rain, and at first it feels completely ordinary. One wet morning has never hurt anyone. By the second day, the ground underfoot has turned soft and dark. By the third day, everything you set down feels faintly damp, even under cover. By the fifth day, something stranger starts to happen. It is not that the rain has grown heavier. It is that nothing from yesterday has had time to dry. The ground never fully dries. The fuel never fully dries. The sleeping place never fully dries. The body never fully warms back up. Yesterday's unfinished problems are still waiting when today's problems arrive. At that point, rain stops behaving like weather. It starts behaving like a baseline you cannot escape. Different climates create very different versions of this problem. This video focuses on one dangerous combination: persistent wetness, cool temperatures, and almost no chance to recover. That combination did not simply make ancient life uncomfortable. It changed how the body, the fire, the shelter, and the people around them all had to work together. This is not really a story about being wet. It is a story about running out of time to recover. So here is the real question hiding behind the title. How did ancient humans survive when the rain simply refused to give them a reset? The honest answer is not that they always stayed dry. It is also not that they were simply tougher than we are. They survived by following one principle: never let every important system fail at the same time. A rainy afternoon is just weather. A rainy month starts to behave like an operating system. And once rain becomes the operating system, the greatest danger is usually what the water causes next. In the cold, wet situation we are following, rain often becomes dangerous indirectly. Its real power is that it makes almost everything else harder. Picture the sequence the way it can actually unfold. The body and the materials around it get wet. In cold, windy conditions, a wet body can lose heat faster than a dry one. Losing heat faster means the body needs more energy just to stay warm. Staying warm requires a place where heat loss can slow and recovery can begin. But the fuel, bedding, or covering meant to protect that place may be damp too. A poor night of recovery means the next day begins with less energy in reserve. With less energy, finding food, protecting fire, repairing shelter, or moving to safer ground all become harder. A tired body pays less attention and makes weaker decisions. A weaker decision can lead to more time exposed to the same wet, cold conditions. None of this is 9 separate disasters. It is one set of risks beginning to feed the next. Think of it as a survival cascade. One failure makes another failure slightly more likely. This does not mean every rainstorm leads to hypothermia. It does not mean every damp environment carries identical risk. The exact sequence changes with climate, season, available resources, and the people involved. What stays constant is the way risks interact instead of arriving one at a time. Ancient humans did not need to defeat the rain outright. They needed to interrupt the cascade somewhere along its length. So here is a fair question to sit with for a moment. If only one link in that chain could be protected first, which one would matter most? Keeping the skin dry sounds like the obvious answer, but a human body can get wet and still recover safely. What matters more is preserving the ability to return to a safe temperature. Try, for a moment, to imagine drying an entire forest. It is obviously impossible. Now imagine something much smaller, keeping one sleeping layer dry enough to use. That is a different kind of problem, and a solvable one. In many wet environments, staying perfectly dry all day was never realistic. Wet grass, damp ground, shallow water, and falling rain were often unavoidable. The real target was narrower, protecting the chance to recover. A body can tolerate a surprising amount of stress for a while. The deeper danger begins when recovery never actually arrives. Recovery meant a handful of specific things: getting out of direct wind, reducing contact with cold, wet ground, reaching warmth when it was available, eating enough to replace lost energy, resting the body instead of continuing to push it. One detail deserves more attention than it usually gets. What is happening underneath the body matters as much as what is above it. Someone lying directly on cold, damp earth can keep losing heat even beneath a roof. A simple layer of grass, leaves, or hides could interrupt that path of heat loss. Its value was keeping the ground from quietly stealing warmth all night. At Border Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have reported plant bedding, mostly grasses, dating to roughly 200,000 years ago. Plant bedding appears repeatedly at the site across tens of thousands of years. Ash found with some of the bedding may have helped discourage crawling insects. This is one documented case, not proof that every group built bedding the same way, or that it was made specifically for prolonged rain. Shelter mattered for a similar reason, and it never needed to resemble a house. It only needed to change a few variables: less direct rain, less wind, less contact with wet ground, a better place to protect essential materials. Perishable shelters preserve poorly in the archaeological record. Much of what we know comes from fragments and cautious comparison with later societies. Ancient humans were not trying to keep the world dry. They were trying to protect small islands of warmth, just enough space for a body to stop sliding downward and begin recovering. But even the best recovery space fails when the systems supporting it fail too. On an ordinary dry day, losing a fire is a nuisance you can fix. In prolonged cold rain, losing reliable heat can become something much bigger. The body has a harder time warming back up. Wet materials become harder to dry. The recovery space stops working as well as it did before. Depending on the food available, cooking may become harder too. Nights grow colder than they need to be, and sleep gets worse. The next day begins from an even weaker starting point. This is exactly where one failure can start becoming several. It would be inaccurate, however, to say that people simply died without fire. Fire's importance varied by climate, season, available food, and the habits of a particular group. Some groups may have possessed reliable ways to relight it. Some environments never made constant fire a daily requirement. But in cold, wet conditions, dependable heat could carry enormous weight. Fire also has an unfortunate talent for becoming most valuable after everything needed to restart it has become damp. The more interesting question is not simply how to make fire. It is how to avoid solving the hardest problem at the worst possible moment. That points toward continuity rather than invention. Protecting tinder before it became soaked. Keeping materials out of direct rain. Using dry material tucked inside split wood. Beneath bark, or under rock where the environment allowed it. Sheltering the hearth where the landscape allowed. And preserving embers as one possible strategy. At this point, a fair question appears. After several rainy days, where could dry material still come from? The honest answer is that it rarely appeared conveniently on its own. Dryness had to be protected almost like a resource in its own right. Archaeological hearths show repeated fire use at many prehistoric sites across long periods. Proving exactly who guarded a fire is much harder. So is proving whether a group carried embers between camps. Later ethnographic examples show that people can preserve or transport embers in several ways. Those examples do not prove that every Paleolithic group used the same method. The deeper breakthrough was continuity, not cleverness for its own sake. Ancient humans were not only solving today's need for heat, they were protecting tomorrow's ability to recover. The easiest leaking shelter to fix is the one repaired before the storm arrives. The easiest tinder to protect is the tinder that was never left exposed. In modern life, weather changes, and people often react after receiving a forecast. In a world with fewer backup systems, important decisions had to be made before conditions became severe. This part of the story is not about mystical weather reading. It is not about treating clouds, birds, or insects as a perfect forecast service. It is about paying attention to consequences. Where will water flow if the rain continues? Which low ground will begin holding water first? Which path will become harder to use with every passing hour? Which materials are exposed and about to become useless? Does tonight's sleeping place sit inside a natural drainage line? How much daylight remains to fix the problem? Should the group keep moving or stop while conditions still allow it? A location can look harmless at 3 in the afternoon and become dangerous by midnight. A shelter that takes 3 hours to repair is less useful after the body is already cold. Enough fuel for tonight is not the same as enough fuel for tomorrow night. In a world without reliable backups, timing functioned almost like a survival technology. It is worth asking directly whether we know ancient people thought this way. Archaeology gives us hearths, bedding, tools, transported materials, and places used repeatedly over time. It does not preserve anyone's weather forecast. Some archaeological traces are consistent with people planning for future needs in other contexts. That makes it reasonable to infer that timing mattered in landscapes shaped by unpredictable weather. It does not justify claiming that people predicted storms with precise accuracy. Choosing higher or better drained ground early could reduce the danger of water pooling later. Protecting tinder in advance made heat continuity easier to maintain. Stopping at the right moment avoided wasting energy that could not be replaced quickly. A single early decision could prevent several later problems from appearing. Ancient survival was never only about endurance. It was also about acting while useful choices were still available. But anticipation has limits of its own. Imagine the rain has now lasted 6 days in a row. The fire needs tending. The covering over the sleeping area has started to leak. Someone is shivering and cannot seem to warm up. Food supplies are getting low, and the bedding has gone damp again. A child needs looking after. and someone still has to sleep. One human body cannot occupy 6 places at the same time. Prolonged rain does not create one big problem. It creates a long list of small, repeating tasks. Gathering fuel, maintaining fire where that matters, repairing whatever is leaking, preparing food, watching over children, supporting anyone who is exhausted or injured, moving materials before they are ruined, resting enough to keep functioning at all. The task list keeps growing, and none of it cares that everyone is tired. A single person can rotate through many of these jobs, but one person cannot tend a fire while searching far from camp. One person cannot sleep while watching for every emerging problem. One person cannot repair a shelter while caring for everyone who is weak or cold. Fatigue is not simply discomfort here. It quietly reduces how much attention and effort a person has left to give. At a certain point, the limiting factor stops being toughness. It becomes workload itself. Now, picture the same 6 days with more than one person present. One person is exhausted, but another still has energy. One person is asleep, but another remains awake and alert. One person cannot travel far, but can still do useful work close to camp. A working group has more than one way to keep functioning when part of it becomes temporarily weak. Only after seeing it in action does this pattern deserve a name: redundancy. The group did not make the rain disappear. It stopped every problem from landing on the same exhausted body. A group gave survival more than one pair of hands. It gave failure somewhere else to go instead of piling onto one person. This does not mean prehistoric groups worked in perfect harmony. It does not mean they always assigned fixed roles by age or gender. It means shared effort could absorb pressure that one body alone could not. But more hands solving today's problem do not automatically create wisdom for tomorrow. Imagine finally discovering the one sleeping place that remains usable after several wet nights. Now imagine that knowledge disappearing the moment its discoverer dies. A discovery nobody remembers might as well have never happened. Cooperation solves the workload of right now. It does little to prevent the same mistake from happening again later. For survival to improve across time, useful information had to survive as well. Across seasons, people could learn which locations flooded easily. They could learn which materials held up better than others. They could learn how to arrange bedding so water drained away. They could learn which ground allowed better rest. They could learn when stopping was wiser than pressing forward. Not every lesson needed to be explained in a formal speech. Learning could happen through watching, imitation, repeated practice, deliberate teaching, and ordinary communication. Picture a child approaching a low, flood-prone hollow as a place to sleep. The child does not need to wake up soaked to discover that it was a bad choice. Someone else can stop the mistake beforehand. A remembered mistake can protect a person who was not alive when that mistake was first made. Sit with that idea for a moment, because it carries real weight. One person has only one lifetime in which to make mistakes and learn from them. A community can allow that experience to outlive any single lifetime. The body can recover. A critical system can be kept continuous. A group can spread an unbearable workload. But culture stops the same preventable failure from starting again. Survival was no longer only a test of the body. It also depended on whether useful knowledge could outlive the person who first paid for it. Archaeology cannot fossilize a spoken warning. Repeated behavior at long-used sites may be consistent with learned practices, but archaeology cannot show exactly how those lessons were transmitted. Those who survived were not relying only on their own bodies. They were also drawing on the accumulated experience of people who had been wrong before them. After everything described so far, one solution seems almost too obvious: leave. Find somewhere drier. So why did human populations continue living where heavy rainfall, wet seasons, or flooding kept returning? Water was never only a cost. Depending on the landscape, rain could feed rivers, lakes, wetlands, and seasonal floodplains. Those environments could support productive plant growth. Some also offered fish, shellfish, waterfowl, or other useful resources. Not every wet environment provided all of these things. Not every wet environment was abundant, but the landscape that made sleeping harder could also help keep people fed. The same floodplain that turned a campsite into standing water in one season could turn into one of the richest feeding grounds in another. Early humans did not necessarily choose such places because of the rain itself, nor can we assume that they calculated every cost and benefit in advance. What is more likely is a slower generational answer. People simply kept living in places that kept working, long enough for the pattern to become a way of life. Across generations, populations could persist where recurring wetness imposed real costs because local resources made those costs worth managing. The challenge was not to make the environment harmless. It was to build enough buffers to keep its dangers from arriving all at once. A protected resting place reduced heat loss. Continuity protected heat and critical materials. Early decisions prevented some problems from forming. Shared effort kept the workload from crushing one exhausted person. Cultural memory reduced the need to relearn every lesson through failure. Each buffer only closed one gap, but together they closed most of them at once. The environment remained difficult, but the risk of several systems failing together could be reduced. Ancient humans were not mastering one perfect, easy habitat. They were learning how to remain functional inside imperfect ones. And now the question in the title can finally be answered properly, not with one magical trick for staying dry, with one underlying principle instead. At the beginning, this looked like a story about rain, but rain was only the first domino. So how did ancient humans survive when the rain simply never stopped? Not by staying perfectly dry. Not because every ancient person was naturally tougher than we are today. Not because one clever invention solved everything at once. In cold, wet conditions, survival began with protecting the body's chance to recover. It depended on keeping critical materials and reliable heat available where they truly mattered. It improved when people acted before conditions removed their better options. It became more robust when overwhelming work was spread across more than one body. It lasted across generations, when costly mistakes were remembered instead of repeatedly paid for. A wet night could increase heat loss. Heat loss could deepen exhaustion. Exhaustion could make essential work and clear decisions harder. A second problem could arrive before the first one had been repaired. The real human advantage was learning where to break that chain. They could not dry an entire forest, but they could protect one small place to recover. They could not command the clouds, but they could avoid the hollow before the water filled it. They could not make one body work forever, but several people could share the load. They could not undo a costly mistake, but they could make sure it was remembered. We often imagine resilience as the ability to absorb more punishment than everyone else. Ancient survival suggests something different. The stronger system is the one that notices where failure begins to spread and stops it there. Resilience is not the ability to suffer forever. It is the ability to stop one failure from becoming 5. The rain can keep falling. The chain does not have to keep falling with it. If you enjoy seeing ancient survival through the systems that made it possible, subscribe for the next question hidden inside our human past.